Welcome to Aaron Mahnke's Cabinet of Curiosities, a production of iHeartRadio and Grim and Mild.
Our world is full of the unexplainable. And if history is an open book, all of these amazing tales are right there on display, just waiting for us to explore. Welcome to the Cabinet of Curiosities. From the turn of the century to the 1940s, summer in New York meant one thing. It was time for a trip to Coney Island. You might rub shoulders with well-heeled Upper East Siders and working-class Brooklynites as you wander through the park, searching for summer fun. You could swim in the bay or brave the wooden roller coasters, or you could wander the boardwalk. And there, barkers called from every direction, urging you to come into their tent. Did you want to see a four-legged woman? Or how about a boy with a face like a dog? But nestled among the strongmen and sword swallowers was a completely different kind of attraction. A small awning filled with even smaller glass boxes. And inside, the tiniest babies you had ever seen. Because from 1903 to 1943, the best place to care for your premature baby was Dr. Martin Cooney's Child Hatchery on the Coney Island Boardwalk. At the turn of the century, the odds for a baby born early weren't great. Hospitals didn't have the advanced medical technology that helps premature infants both survive and thrive. Even if they did, however, many wouldn't have used it. Unfortunately, the attitude at the time was that premature babies were weak and not meant to live. If they survived their early birth, great, but if they didn't, then it just wasn't meant to be. Either way, most hospitals wouldn't waste valuable time and resources on them. While this cruel take on survival of the fittest was common in the medical field, it wasn't the rule. In the 1870s, several doctors had been inspired by the incubators used to hatch chickens and were trying to perfect a version for human babies. By 1896, French doctor Pierre Constant Boudin had invented an incubator that he called a child hatchery. The device would keep a premature infant warm and safe from infection long enough to survive. He sent his assistant, a young trainee named Martin Cooney, to exhibit his child hatchery at the 1896 Great Industrial Exposition in Berlin. For his demonstration in Berlin, Cooney filled the incubators with live children. It was an immediate hit. Cooney was invited to exhibitions across Europe and America, and even displayed the incubators at Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. Soon, Cooney had left his mentor behind, touring the United States with his own improved incubators. As he traveled, he refined his standard of care, employing specially trained nurses and developing round-the-clock feeding schedules. After bouncing between expos and World's Fairs for several years, he decided to open a permanent home for his incubators in 1903 on Coney Island. And so there on the boardwalk, passers-by could pay a quarter to step inside and see the tiny infants. Some were barely more than 2 or 3 pounds in size. To demonstrate that, one nurse would perform a trick of slipping her wedding ring around a baby's thin wrist. From the start, there was backlash. Critics felt that displaying the preemies like sideshow freaks was exploitative. Others worried their proximity to boardwalk trash and unwanted live animals would invite disease and infection. Still others took the hospital's stance that these babies shouldn't have medical intervention at all. And yet to the families whose children were on display, Cooney wasn't so much a sideshow barker as a saint. The Coney Island Incubator Show was most families' only chance to save their infants. Expert care was provided free of charge, covered by every 25-cent entry fee that people paid to see them. Anyone could have their premature baby cared for, regardless of race or class. Dr. Cooney's own daughter, born premature, spent time in the incubator tent. For 40 years, Cooney's Coney Island attraction cared for thousands of premature babies. When he was finally ready to retire, it seemed like the world had finally caught up to his beliefs. In 1943, the same year Cooney's incubators closed their doors, Cornell Hospital in Manhattan opened the country's first dedicated premature infant ward. Cooney was a controversial figure, at times a showman and a savior. He was largely dismissed by the medical community as an opportunist, and when he died in 1950, it was in relative obscurity. It certainly didn't help his standing with his critics when it was later discovered that he had likely lied about his background. That story about apprenticing under Dr. Boudin in Paris, well, it may have never happened. And Cooney himself might not have actually been a medical doctor. And still, that probably didn't make a difference to the over 6,500 babies that Dr. Kunis saved. So maybe for all those years, nestled between the sword swallowers and tattooed ladies, it was Dr. Kunis' tent that was truly the greatest show on Earth. Here's a lesson that you don't want to learn firsthand. Rabies totally bites. The virus that sealed Old Yeller's fate is awful, and once symptoms set in, it's almost guaranteed to kill you. It attacks the brain and spinal cord, causing burning sensations, intense headaches, and partial paralysis. As the disease progresses, it inflicts an arsenal of horrific psychological effects, starting with anxiety and restlessness, progressing to full-on hydrophobia. That's an extreme fear of water, made worse by intense muscle spasms that make swallowing water nearly impossible. The fear, the pain, and the confusion get worse until you either choke to death on your own saliva or your heart stops. But here's the good news. The modern rabies vaccine is pretty bulletproof. It will save your life, assuming you get the shot soon after contracting the virus. But before it was developed, there was virtually no reliable treatment. For those unlucky enough to contract it, rabies was a nightmarish prospect that usually meant certain death. This is best illustrated by a story from 1852, 33 years before there was a rabies vaccine. The life of a prairie man from Illinois was turned upside down one morning when his 9-year-old son Robert was attacked by a stray dog. They managed to drive the animal off, but not before the boy was bitten. Now, dread gripped this man as he examined the wound. The dog had been strangely aggressive and frothing at the mouth, both clear signs of rabies, which meant that Robert had most likely contracted the disease. This man was well aware of the seriousness of the situation, having grown up on the frontier, where rabies-carrying animals like skunks and bats were common. At this point, there were only 3 real options. Option 1, accept the boy's fate and prepare to put him out of his misery should the symptoms arise. Option 2, cauterize the wound with a piece of hot metal and hope that that killed the virus before it spread. This would obviously be painful and probably ineffective. Which left option 3, get Robert to a medical practitioner in possession of a madstone. Now, while they've fallen out of use today, a madstone was long thought to be the only antidote against rabies. Beyond that, the definition can be a bit flexible. Madstones varied in size, shape, and origin. Most often, though, they were small, polished clumps of hair and other materials taken from the stomachs or bladders of wild animals like deer. In other words, hairballs. Now, Robert's father was an educated man. He worked as a lawyer, in fact, and he didn't put much stock in folklore remedies. But with no other antidotes available, he was desperate enough to try anything. After asking around, he learned about a doctor one state over who actually owned a madstone. A few hours later, this man and his 9-year-old son were on a train bound for Terre Haute, Indiana. By nightfall, they were seated in the doctor's kitchen, watching as the gray-haired man took a jar down from the shelf. He removed a small, dark pebble and placed it in a pot of fresh milk, giving it several minutes to soak up the liquid. Then he took the stone and held it against the boy's bite mark. When he removed his hand, the stone stuck in place. And that was bad news, the doctor said. It meant that Robert was infected, but there was still a chance to save him. For the rest of the night, they kept the stone pressed against the wound. Whenever it dried out and fell off, the doctor would place it back in a pot of boiling milk. Green scum soon rose to the surface, indicating that the stone had extracted some of the poison. They repeated the process until it was almost morning. And finally, as dawn broke, the stone refused to stick to the wound. The poison had all been soaked up. Now, the lawyer was skeptical, but also hopeful. He asked the doctor for the bill, but the man refused payment, saying that taking money for using a madstone would dampen its efficacy. And yeah, the lawyer wasn't sure what to make of that, but after a few days, Robert still had not displayed any rabies symptoms. They returned home to Springfield, relieved and eager to put the experience behind them. And the lawyer still wasn't sure that he believed in the madstone, and he didn't speak of it much after that. But the people of Terre Haute remembered the visit, especially a few years later, when that lawyer, or should I say, Abraham Lincoln, became the 16th president of the United States. I hope you've enjoyed today's guided tour of the Cabinet of Curiosities. Subscribe for free on Apple Podcasts or learn more about the show by visiting curiositiespodcast.com. This show was created by me, Aaron Mahnke, in partnership with How Stuff Works. I make another award-winning show called Lore, which is a podcast, book series, and television show, and you can learn all about it over at theworldoflore.com. And until next time, stay curious.